Hi, everyone, and welcome to yet another Ancient Warfare Answers with Murray. I will be your host to give you your fill of Ancient Warfare this week. 10 minutes of thick, fast Ancient Warfare history. And the question we have today is from Doug, but before that, of course, you can ask a question. You can become a Patreon at the website and just go to www.patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. You can become a Patreon at one of three levels. You can send us an email. You can send us a message. You can ask us your burning question about Ancient Warfare. Now, the question that we have today is from Doug Fulkerson, and I've split your question into two, Doug, which is, I have a question about the wars between Carthage and Syracuse in the 300s and 400s BC. What kinds of armies, weapons, and tactics were used on both sides? So there's a PhD thesis in itself, and I'm going to try and give a 10-minute answer without speaking at light speed. One part of that answer is we don't know. And the reality is that we have much less information on the armies of Carthage than we would have if we had a Carthaginian source that survived. One of the problems we have is, of course, that we have Roman sources which talk about the Carthaginians, but they don't really give us any detail. We've got some archaeology which tells us, and then on the other hand, we've got several bits of information which seem to paint a picture, but can we rely on it? For instance, we're told about the Carthaginian phalanx. Now, phalanx is one of those words where it has a specific meaning when it comes to the Macedonian phalanx, for instance. But the phalanx existed, or a phalanx existed before the Macedonians, but it just means a body of men. Homer uses it. So it kind of goes from a non-technical through to a technical usage, and then goes back to a non-technical usage. So that's one of the problems. We don't know how many ranks, for instance, are in a Carthaginian army. We don't know the specifics of any smaller unit types in the Carthaginian army. We get a couple of mentions in later Carthaginian history, for instance, of the Sacred Band. So like, Sacred Band? That must be modeled after the Thebans. But the problem is, of course, that the Theban Sacred Band is 300 men. The Carthaginian Sacred Band is 5,000, which is kind of like, hang on a minute, that's very big. Are they different training? We don't know. So there's that, the white shields. Well, they got white shields. That's very much how we're told. We do have some archaeology which shows some kinds of shield designs for the Carthaginians. We know that they had both oval and round shields. We know that their men are armed with spears and javelins and swords, which is very, very similar to the Romans that they face and the Greeks that they face. We also know, of course, that the Carthaginian armies use a lot of mercenaries. And obviously Hannibal later is putting his mercenaries in the center of his line so that they take the most damage, and therefore you have to pay them less because there's less of them, that's wrong, because generally speaking, of course, when you have mercenaries, you pay them up front, or you at least pay them something up front. They're not coming on warfare for nothing. They're expecting to get plunder. They're probably going to get paid for continuing to serve, but they're generally paid when they join. So they've got some money already. So you are reducing costs, obviously, by having mercenaries front the most danger, but it certainly isn't a way of avoiding paying them at all. And you've got sort of both the cavalry of the Carthaginians. So obviously they use the Numidian light cavalry. Later on, they use Gallic and Spanish infantry after they've conquered Spain, which is between the First and the Second Punic Wars. But they seem to have always used quite a large number of mercenaries. And in a way, that makes them very similar to the Syracusans. Syracuse is one of the wealthiest cities in the Greek world in its entirety. It has local hoplites, citizen hoplites, as per other Greek cities, but it hires in vast amounts of hoplites and other troop types from elsewhere in Greece, to the point where it's a known employer And we've got lots of evidence, for instance, of Cretan archers being hired by the Syracusans, other hoplites being hired. Obviously, they bring in commanders, and this will relate to the second part of your question, Doug, which is about Timoleon, who's sent from Corinth. We've got Xanthippus, who's sent from Sparta. So there seems to be some kind of huge industry of working with mercenaries in Sicily. So the interesting thing there is, of course, that what you've got in a way is two different types of phalanx. What we think would be a Greek hoplite phalanx, complete with mercenary light armed troops and other types of troops, and a Carthaginian phalanx, again, complete with spearmen, swordsmen, heavy infantry, and other troop types that are used as mercenaries as well. So in many ways, our kind of information is sort of stuck at that point, whereby we have terminology which isn't specific but could be. It's also used of both sides, and that extends into the Carthaginian leadership as well, that we get told of, the Carthaginian Senate, and we get told of there's the Barcid family and others. So it's very hard to know what exactly the magistrates of Carthage look like. We get told of kings. We've got King Hanno, for instance, and we've got other sort of names. The Sufes, for instance, seems to be some kind of senior official name. So unfortunately, our information for the Carthaginian armies is kind of incomplete. And again, for this period, we generally have the name of a general, maybe a second in command or a subordinate commander, and troops. We don't really get any greater breakdown than that. As I said, one of the exceptions is we get this naming of this sacred band, but it's an enormous unit, much, much larger than the one that it seems to be modeled on. And again, what we have in several of the anecdotes for the Syracusans is we have Syracuse by this point is a tyranny. So there are a succession of tyrants at Syracuse, and they hire huge numbers of mercenaries. Now, generally speaking, mercenaries are hired with a commander who then gets hired under another overall commander. And we do get several anecdotes of individual groups of mercenaries, going rogue or proving loyal to one or another of those commanders rather than the people who hired them. And of course, generally speaking, that would be down to being told that they could make more money by plundering their bosses than taking their money, which is a perennial problem with mercenaries, unfortunately. And we also have several inscriptions which survive, and interestingly, several epigrams, Callimachus and others in the Palatine anthology, of mercenaries who seem to have come from Carthage, who seem to have come from Syracuse, and generally those are really interesting because it looks like they've left Syracuse when the war finished, and then they've moved somewhere else, generally to Alexandria, which seems to be a bit of a mercenary hub. And of course, the interesting thing about the mercenaries in Greek warfare is that at the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War in 404, we've got huge numbers of Greek citizens from various cities throughout Greece who are itching to, go on adventures. The most famous of those, of course, is the expedition of Cyrus, as recorded by Xenophon in the Anabasis. And so, they're men for hire. There's the idea that one of the Methone Peninsula in the Peloponnese, you just gathered there, and eventually some ship would come past and hire you, because that's where the mercenaries gathered in Greece. So there certainly is a livelihood to be made in Greece as a mercenary hoplite, and it would seem that in Sicily and the Carthaginians and and elsewhere in Asia Minor and Italy even, there is a great career to be had as a mercenary. We've even got some evidence that, a particular band of mercenaries is serving all over the place in the Eastern Mediterranean, because they seem to have inscribed their arrowheads with a particular monogram, and that monogram turns up in all sorts of spots. What the monogram actually means, we're not sure. It could be a commander's name. It could be a city name. It could be essentially a logo of that unit. We're not sure. But those arrowheads turn up all over the place in the Eastern Mediterranean. So, that's probably very dissatisfying attempt at an answer to say, A, lots of types of troops from both sides, and B, we don't know. But that tends to be the way it is in most cases in ancient history and ancient warfare, unfortunately. Hopefully that gives us some answers. And next week, I'll be answering a question which kind of relates to what I've just talked about, looking at a particular battle between the Carthaginians and the Syracusans. So we'll see you then.